There are seasons in life that feel almost too cruel to be real, relationships that drain you, words that distort reality, and a constant emotional fog that makes you question your sanity, your worth, even your faith. If you've ever been caught in the orbit of a narcissist, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The manipulation isn't always loud. Sometimes it's subtle, coated in charm or wrapped in guilt. But the impact is the same: confusion, emotional exhaustion, and a spiritual disorientation that leaves you wondering, why me? Why this? But what if that question, why me, has an answer that isn't rooted in punishment or misfortune, but trust? What if God allowed you to walk through this chaos not because you were weak, but because He saw strength in you couldn't yet see in yourself? What if the pain wasn't random, but part of a deeper spiritual training that would forge in you a kind of clarity, authority, and compassion that can't be taught in peace, only formed in fire? This message isn't about blame. It's about reframing, because narcissistic abuse is not just psychological, it's spiritual. It distorts truth, attacks identity, and thrives in darkness. And if God entrusted you with that battle, it means He also intends to equip you with the victory. Not just for your healing, but so you can become a light for others still trapped in that same storm. So today, we're not just going to talk about surviving narcissistic chaos. We're going to talk about the calling inside the chaos. Why you were chosen, what's really happening behind the scenes, and how God is not only with you in it. He's using it to reveal something sacred within you. This isn't just a message, it's a mirror. And by the end of it, you'll see yourself and your suffering differently. When people ask, why would God let me go through something like this? Specifically, the emotional and psychological chaos that comes from being entangled with a narcissist. The assumption behind the question is that such suffering must be the result of punishment, misdirection, or weakness. But that assumption overlooks something crucial. Not every burden is given because of failure. Some are given because of strength. Not strength you necessarily feel in the moment, but strength God knows is there. Strength that hasn't yet been revealed because it hasn't yet been required. Endurance isn't just something you stumble into. It's something forged under pressure, and spiritual endurance, the kind that transforms chaos into wisdom and pain into purpose, doesn't emerge in comfort. It's assigned. It's deliberate. And sometimes that assignment looks like walking through a fire someone else set, with no map and no validation, just a quiet inner conviction that somehow you're supposed to get through it without losing yourself. Narcissistic chaos isn't like ordinary relational dysfunction. It's disorienting by design. You begin to question your reality, your memory, even your perception of right and wrong. That's not accidental. That's strategic. It's psychological warfare masquerading as love, intimacy, or authority. And when you're in that space, your soul becomes a battlefield. But here's the paradox. If you're in that battle, it's because something in you is already a threat to the darkness. You don't get targeted by manipulation unless truth lives in you. You don't get pulled into psychological confusion unless you carry the kind of clarity that exposes it. So, what if God entrusted you with this chaos because He knew you wouldn't bow to it forever? What if your ability to endure not perfectly but faithfully was part of a much larger strategy, not just for your survival but for the healing of others? Because let's be honest, people who have never walked through this kind of mental and emotional warfare have no language for it. They offer clichés, not comfort. They prescribe scriptures but lack insight. But you, once you've walked through it, you carry a depth and discernment that can't be taught. It has to be earned, and it's earned in the arena where your tears become your testimony. Psychologically, we know that the human spirit is capable of resilience far beyond what it assumes, but that resilience often requires a context, an event, a relationship, a conflict that awakens it. Spiritually, that awakening is often the very thing God allows not to harm you, but to unearth you. not to destroy you, but to develop something unshakable within you. So maybe the question isn't why did this happen to me? Maybe the question is, what does this chaos reveal about the strength God already saw in me? Because once you begin to ask that, the story shifts from victimhood to assignment, from survival to purpose. You weren't punished with chaos, you were trusted with it. Now the challenge is to rise into the strength you didn't know you had. Most people think narcissistic abuse is just emotional immaturity, something you can reason with, negotiate around, or fix with enough love. But that's a dangerously naive perspective. What you're often dealing with is something far more calculated, corrosive, and spiritually entangled. It's not just emotional dysfunction, it's spiritual warfare in disguise. And until you begin to see it through that lens, you will continue to fight the wrong enemy on the wrong battlefield, using tools that don't work. At its core, narcissism is rooted in deception. It thrives on twisting truth, redefining reality, and distorting identity, both yours and theirs. When someone manipulates you long enough, they're not just shifting facts or framing arguments. They're targeting your perception of what's real. That's why, after enough time, you start questioning your instincts, your judgment, even your memory. You begin to feel like you're the problem, that maybe you're too sensitive, too unforgiving, too dramatic. That confusion isn't accidental, it's engineered. And if you trace that pattern back far enough, you'll see its spiritual fingerprints. The enemy has always attacked truth first. In the garden, in the wilderness, in the quiet corners of your mind. Satan doesn't come at you with obvious destruction. He comes at you with doubt. Did God really say? That's not just a line from Genesis. It's the whisper behind every manipulative relationship you've ever endured. Did they really mean that? Maybe it's just you. You're overreacting again. These aren't just gaslighting phrases. They're modern echoes of an ancient strategy. Erode your trust in truth, and you'll eventually surrender your sense of self. What's especially insidious is how narcissistic chaos often masquerades as righteousness. It uses spiritual language, flattery, even selective scripture to maintain control. It presents itself as confidence, leadership, or even divine authority, but underneath it all, it's still deception. And if you don't have a discerning spirit, if you don't see the spiritual nature of what's happening, you'll internalize their dysfunction as your failure. So here's the shift. You have to recognize that what feels like a personal attack is often part of a larger spiritual pattern. You're not weak because you feel confused. You're not broken because you struggle to detach. You're in a battle that was designed to drain clarity and isolate you from truth. And the longer you believe it's just relationship drama, the longer you'll stay unequipped to break free. Once you start seeing narcissistic abuse as spiritual warfare, everything changes. You stop playing defense emotionally, and you start fighting intentionally, spiritually, mentally, and with truth as your weapon. You begin to filter their words not through your wounds, but through wisdom. You stop asking for their validation, and you start reclaiming your voice. The chaos isn't random, it's a tactic. But once you name it, once you see it clearly, you strip it of its power. Because the enemy's greatest weapon is confusion, and your greatest weapon is truth, spoken with clarity, held with conviction, and lived without apology. One of the most exhausting dynamics in a relationship with a narcissist is the unspoken pressure to carry what they refuse to take responsibility for. You're constantly absorbing their anger, their insecurity, their guilt. None of it belongs to you, but all of it seems to land in your lap. And over time, if you're not careful, you begin to believe it's your job to manage their chaos, to keep the peace, to hold everything together. But here's the truth. You were never meant to be a sponge. You were meant to be a mirror. Let's unpack that for a moment. A sponge absorbs. It takes in whatever is around it. No filter, no judgment, no protection. That's what a lot of empathic, sensitive people do in the presence of narcissism. They absorb the mood, the manipulation, the guilt trips, the repressed rage. Why? Often because they're kind, because they're compassionate, because they've been conditioned to confuse passivity with peace. But that kind of absorption doesn't bring peace. It brings slow destruction. It erodes your identity, confuses your conscience, and makes you responsible for someone else's emotional immaturity. A mirror, on the other hand, doesn't absorb, but reflects. It reveals what's there. It stands in truth, even if the truth is uncomfortable. And here's the thing, narcissists don't want a mirror. They want a sponge. They want someone who won't hold them accountable, someone who will internalize their dysfunction and call it love. But that's not love. That's spiritual codependency. That's enabling. And if God trusted you with this chaos, it's not so you could soak it in. It's so you could expose it with clarity, compassion, and conviction. This is where spiritual discernment becomes essential, because it's tempting to mistake turn the other cheek, for never speak the truth. But Jesus didn't absorb falsehood. He confronted it. He wasn't cruel, but he was clear. He called out hypocrisy even when it came from religious leaders. He showed us that truth and grace are not opposites. They're inseparable. And when you reflect truth instead of absorbing distortion, you actually honor the image of God in yourself. Psychologically speaking, when you start mirroring instead of absorbing, you shift from reactive to grounded. You stop explaining your boundaries and start embodying them. You stop asking, "Why don't they understand me?" and start realizing they need me to misunderstand myself so they can keep control. That's the trap, and refusing to absorb anymore is how you break it. You're not cold for stepping back. You're not selfish for protecting your peace. You're simply refusing to carry what isn't yours. And that's not rebellion, that's wisdom. The goal isn't to fix them, it's to stay whole. And sometimes staying whole means holding up the mirror, not so they'll change, but so you don't forget who you are. There's something deeply paradoxical about pain. It doesn't just hurt, it forms. And the kind of chaos created by a narcissist doesn't simply leave you wounded, it leaves you reshaped. But the question is, reshaped into what? That depends entirely on whether you interpret the chaos as senseless suffering or as a kind of divine refinement. Because here's the hard but liberating truth. God uses chaos to forge spiritual authority. Now, that word authority, it's often misunderstood. People think of it as dominance or control, especially in religious or psychological contexts. But true spiritual authority is something very different. It's not loud, it's not performative, it doesn't demand the room, it simply walks in truth, unshaken. It carries a weight, a clarity, a presence that doesn't come from self. Confidence, it comes from having been through the fire and not lost your soul in the process. Think about it. The people you trust most deeply aren't the ones with the most answers. They're the ones with the most scars, but somehow they're still standing, still kind, still clear. That kind of person has spiritual authority. And you don't get there by reading books. You get there by surviving what should have broken you, and choosing daily not to become what wounded you. When you're in the middle of narcissistic chaos, everything feels foggy. You don't know which way is up. Your instincts are scrambled, your emotions are hijacked, and your sense of self seems like it's slipping through your fingers. And yet, it's there, in that environment, that something sacred begins to happen. You start to develop a kind of discernment, not just emotional intelligence, but spiritual clarity. You begin to recognize patterns, lies, tactics, and even more importantly, you start to recognize yourself again, not as they define you, but as God does. This is the furnace where strength is forged, not the kind of strength that hardens into bitterness, but the kind that matures into wisdom. You become less reactive, more intentional, less hungry for validation, more anchored in truth. That's authority, not over others, but over yourself. That's the kind of authority narcissists hate because they can't control it. And it's the kind of authority God develops in those He's calling to lead, to heal, to speak into darkness without flinching. So maybe that chaos you walked through wasn't just a tragedy. Maybe it was training. And maybe the pain that nearly took you out was also the pressure that formed a kind of strength in you that the world desperately needs. A voice that's been tested, a spirit that's been refined, a clarity that can't be faked. You didn't just survive the fire, you were shaped by it, and now you carry something real, something weighty. Spiritual authority is the quiet strength to walk into any room, any situation, any relationship, and remain whole. That's what the chaos was forging in you, and now it's time to use it.